everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor, please subscribe if you haven't already. Gather round, bookworms, because the time has come for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today, you will get to hear Chapter 16 of My Effin Life by Geddy Lee. Now, let's see what Chapter 16 has in store for us. In 1979, we toured continental Europe for the first time. We were slated to kick off in Paris, but the gig was cancelled due to a fire in the venue. So now, our first show was Poperinge in the Flemish part of Belgium, a bizarre contrast with the multiple sold-out shows we'd enjoyed in cities all over the UK. The tiny venue backed onto a farmer's field, so that when you slid open the doors to the dressing room, you got cattle, fences, and farmhouses, and you could take a leak right out onto the pasture. Human attendance, meanwhile, must have been under 1,000 people, a large portion of which were grizzly bikers who looked every bit as intimidating as in North America. After the show, Hearns came to the door and told us a couple of them wanted to come in the dressing room. We were in the midst of changing back into our civvies, but didn't want to fuss, so I said, "Sure, let them in." I guess. The room fell quiet as three gnarly-looking dudes clomped in. They strode up to us and said, "Rush?" "Yes," we answered warily. "Excuse us, Rush. We just wanted to say that we are big fans of you, and can we get your signature, please?" Phew. On the way to a hotel in Wheal, we passed monuments and memorials to the fallen heroes at Ypres and Flanders Fields and elsewhere, all familiar from our history books. On those memorials by roadsides, town squares, and churches were listed the names of the citizens who had lost their lives, and I realized that we were driving over the very battlefields where those men had fallen. It was an eerie feeling that stalked me as we moved across Europe. I related that to Neil, who one day turned it into a lyric about regional chauvinism in territories. We see so many tribes overrun and undermined, while their invaders dream of lands they've left behind, better people, better food, and better beer. Why move around the world when Eden was so near? With 3 days rest before our next gig in Oslo, Norway, I scooted off with a couple of my pals for our first ever visit to Paris, hoovering up as many of the classic destinations as possible, devouring frites and guzzling high-octane beers in cafes. Late into our final night, there we realized that, aside from a single credit card, we had no money, barely a sou, but scraped together just enough francs and centimes to buy a farewell draught beer before heading to the airport. Why were we so broke? Well, we had decided that before leaving, we simply had to buy 3 berets, 3 red scarves, and 3 blue and white striped shirts to wear on the plane, so that we could arrive in Norway as the 3 old men of Paris. After Oslo, we played Gothenburg, and then Stockholm. I love being a stranger in a strange land, in a time-worn foreign city, my brain trying to make sense of the language, my senses alive to everything around me, to the feeling that generations have been pounding the pavement beneath my feet before me. By comparison, everything in North America seems so unfinished. I'm powerfully drawn to old things, buildings, photographs, baseballs, even old bass guitars, that for me become windows onto the past with stories to tell. Exploring Europe was making me hungrier to see the world than I had ever been before. I had the bug all right, big time, but our next stop, Germany, was instilling no small amount of trepidation in me. After all, while I was having a fine adventure, making fresh discoveries, I could not forget that my family was originally from the same continent under very different circumstances, ultimately abducted, decimated, and given little option but to escape it. And by the time we arrived in Nuremberg, I was rattled to my core. Still haunted by the hellish stories of my parents' experiences, I reflexively thought of Deutschland as the epicenter of evil. When I walked through the facade of the Grand Hotel in Nuremberg, I got chills. I checked into my room, and though it was now a refurbished modern suite like so many others I had stayed in over the years, I could not bring myself to remove my jacket. With the litany of stories from my mother's lips crowding out my brain, I couldn't shake the feeling that during the rise of the worst fascist regime the world has seen, the German High Command might have stayed in that very room. And not just that, I was also painfully aware that this hotel was just up the street from the infamous Palace of Justice, where in 1945 the Nazis had most certainly been put on trial. No wonder I was seeing ghosts, further feeding my hallucinations. When I switched the radio on, I found it tuned to, of all things, the American Armed Forces radio network. Thankfully, they were talking about baseball, and the room began to warm as I returned to my senses. Still, I had to get out. I went for a walk, observing and eavesdropping on people from every walk of life going on about their regular day. I bought a Frankfurter and sat listening to German being spoken, and was shocked to find, due to its similarity with Yiddish, how much I could understand. And every time I saw someone old, I could not help but ask myself, what was he doing back then? Where was she? The end of that tour was a limp to the finish line, literally. The morning after the show in Hamburg, the plane was to drive promptly to Mannheim, but Alex injured his finger in his hotel room during what I must assume was some sort of Serbian mating ritual with Charlene, and had to go to the hospital, where they drilled a hole in his fingernail to relieve the swelling. He then insisted on taking the wheel out on the Autobahn, which, as you probably know, has no speed limit. Pedal to the metal, he lost control as he noticed too late that he was about to fly past the Ausgang and badly rammed a road sign. The police arrived but spoke no English, while he spoke no German, requiring them to wait 2 hours for a translator. And then, when he finally caught up with us in Mannheim, he was in too much pain to play, so we canceled the gig at the last moment, and the following two as well. We hung out in Zurich for a couple of days as he recovered, and did manage to make it to Holland's Pink Pop, the world's longest-running annual pop and rock festival, with a star-studded lineup, including Dire Straits, Elvis Costello, Peter Tosh, and right before us on one of the festival's 3 stages, the Police. They were riding high with Roxanne that summer, and everywhere you went their catchy, reggae-fied melodies put a bounce in your step. Darlings of the press corps, they mugged and cavorted for the paparazzi at every opportunity, and after their set dove straight into a swimming pool that was backstage. Only time I've seen that, with all their clothes on. Sting in his jumpsuit. Also back there was a low wall, the other side of which was a concrete staircase leading to the exit. After sound check, my keyboard tech Jack Secret, quite possibly under the influence of the demon weed, hopped over it and fell 25 feet through the air as Jan Smeets, the promoter, shouted, "His feet! He's broken his feet!" Howling in pain, Jack was carried by Lurch across the field to a medical tent, whence he was taken to another hospital, but insisted on being brought back straight away, so he could program the keyboards at the side of the stage, even while prone and in plaster. He spent the rest of the summer recovering on his mom's sofa, but man, what a trooper! After the tour, our battery sorely needed recharging, so we decided to take a 6-week break, the first of that length since Neil had joined the band. Then in midsummer, we moved into a house on Lakewood's Farms in Flesherton, Ontario, hoping to replicate the kind of isolated rural work environment we had enjoyed in Wales. The bonus being that it was just a 2-hour drive away, so we could slip out for the weekends and see our families. We set up our gear in the basement and hunkered down to write. Our approach to permanent waves would be a total reaction to hemispheres. Instead of composing sidelong interconnecting pieces, we wanted to create songs no more than 5 to 7 minutes long. We were still after big ideas and complexity, but thought we'd win them more flexibility if we freed them from a strict overarching narrative. A small C concept album this time, loosely tied together by a broad theme. We were determined to approach this album with crisp professional dispatch, and as it turned out, everything about making permanent waves was shockingly painless. We bust out quickly, the ideas flowed, and in no time we had written The Spirit of Radio. This was a time when new wave or alternative rock was trending on radio across North America, and one particular station just outside Toronto was making its mark with a looser format that, as Neil told the CBC, he found inspiring. I remember coming home very late, and as I was cresting the escarpment with all the lights below of Hamilton and the Niagara Peninsula where I lived at the time, CFNY Radio was on the air with a fantastic combination of music. CFNY's motto was The Spirit of Radio. The song itself musically is switching between radio stations, with a reggae section at the end. The second verse is new wave. I'm playing like a punk drummer there, and that was all intentional. With a bunch of songs tuned up and fingers in good form, we were primed to start recording at Le Studio in Morin Heights, deep in ski country, an hour north of Montreal and overlooking the Laurentian foothills. It didn't take us long to fall in love with the place, so much so that we'd record or mix the next 5 and parts of 8 albums there. It was just 5 hours from our homes, meaning we could drive there with ease, and Brune could bring along his Cocker Spaniel, our mascot, Daisy, or Ski Bane, the nickname she'd earned for her knack of being unfailingly underfoot when Neil and Alex went cross-country skiing. You feel the province's French influence even before you get to Quebec. As soon as you pass Kingston on Highway 401 and start seeing bands advertising the classic Quebecois delicacy, fries with cheese curds and gravy, then you cross the border, and everywhere there are houses with colorful sloping metal roofs to help the massive snowfalls melt and slide off, and instead of convenience stores, corner stores. You approach the teeny village of Morin Heights and zoom past the local watering hole, the Commons Hotel, where David Bowie, the Bee Gees, Chicago, Bryan Adams, Sting, The Cult, Keith Richards, Rupert Hine, our own Jack Secret, and more have been known to quaff a few, playing a game of pool or jam with local bands after their sessions up the road. Most days, sunlight streamed through the studio's floor-to-ceiling windows facing onto the lake, a welcome change from the bunker atmosphere of most recording studios. Most important, the control room featured a Trident A range console, which provided the sound we knew and trusted from our time at Trident in London. Making permanent waves with the Trident from start to finish would give us a continuity of sound, the first time that had happened since our Toronto sound days. Like at Rockfield, the studio's isolated location allowed us to record outdoors, with the added bonus of being able to bounce an amplified guitar across the lake and off the foothills for some truly natural echo. And we were able to create our own tidal pool sound effect for Natural Science by recording Neil and Alex gently paddling on the lake. On the far side of the water sat a 4-bedroom guest house and a 1-room cottage where we lived for the next few weeks, feasting on meals prepared by a celebrated local chef, Andre Paul Moreau. We'd also eat at his restaurant, Le Bouffe, in Brochet, in Saint-Sauveur-des-Monts, a ski town a 20-minute drive away, whose streets were lined with French restaurants, making the place just as busy or busier in the summer as it was in the winter. I was by no means a foodie back then, but in many ways, this is where my interest in food and wine took flight. Every day in the chalet, Andre would pack a Beaujolais for us, usually a Brouilly, which I knew nothing about, other than that it was fruity and enjoyable. But the idea of having wine with dinner on a daily basis appealed to me. It felt so civilized. My keyboard tech Jack Secret, meanwhile, was a teetotal cannabis man who preferred a Coca-Cola. So Chef Andre would fill his wine glass to the brim with Coke and announce with a glint in his eye, "Voilà, Jacques, le Beaujolais Américain." While writing this book, I've made it a point to listen to every single thing I've recorded in the last 50 years and make a note of my feelings, however good, bad, indifferent, or painful. For want of space and your tolerance, I can't talk about every album we released, 38 including our solo records. But right here, I'd like to stop and reflect on one song in particular, Free Will, that over the years has sparked some controversy. I played it in concert hundreds of times since its release in 1980, and although I always sang it with everything I had, back in the day, I must have taken its impact a little for granted. I accept that every music lover is going to interpret songs their own way. That's just the unwritten contract between writer and fan. It's all in the game. Sometimes the two align, and sometimes not. But over time, every artist also has the right to change the way they originally felt about their own creation. Call it a mark of personal growth. With that in mind, here are a few words about the law of unexpected consequences. When I was young, I ran away from the obligations of the religious household in which I was raised. I felt like I was exercising my free will, but because I was headstrong, I didn't fully understand the implications of my actions. In those days, I would grab onto whatever ideas supported my aspirations, both personally and as a professional musician. I was trying to forge my own identity. Then, as the band fought to resist the corporate pressure to commercialize, I needed even more backbone and found strength in the Ayn Rand books Neil introduced me to, in particular the artistic manifesto evidenced in The Fountainhead, and to a lesser extent the virtue of selfishness. In 1979, when he handed me the lyrics for Free Will, I instantly loved the song. It was a powerful expression of the way Rush was taking control of its own destiny, and also echoed my own refusal of religious dogma, of subjection to the hand of God, or more abstractly, fate. Even if some of Neil's concepts were a bit of a stretch for me, I sang it every night with confidence and pride, offering it to our audiences as a contribution to the time-honored discussion about existentialism, determinism, and faith. It was in fact indeterminism that I believe was at the heart of it, the idea that our lives are not predetermined. And I hoped they would come across, but in the 4 decades since, I've seen people play fast and loose with the interpretation of the last lines of the chorus. I will choose a path that's clear, I will choose free will. To my dismay, those words have been cited without regard for the song's overall message and used as a catch-all, a license for some to do whatever they want. It makes me want to scream. Taken out of context, it becomes an oversimplified idea of free will, narrow and naive, not taking into consideration that even the strongest individual must, to some extent, bow to the needs of a responsible society. Too often it's seized upon as a reckless substitute for common sense. During 2020, I saw this firsthand. When I posted a picture on Instagram of myself wearing a mask, loudmouths were quick to throw free will back at me, as if those 2 words alone constitute permission to act without regard for the well-being of others, to ignore science, and to rid ourselves of responsibility for the consequences of our actions. To me, it was stupidity, taking shelter in poorly thought-through ideology, holding on to the lyric as if it meant, I can be as selfish as I want to be. Well, folks, from where I sit, it ain't that simple. I've read the book and the fine print. Life is not so black and white. We live in its gray areas. I'm afraid that life is too complicated for us to simply choose free will. You can't just say or do anything, prizing your rights over everyone else's. Generations of scholars, notably the Talmudic ones, have spent their lives arguing in Byzantine detail the interpretation of society's rules, because it all depends on context. When exactly will I choose free will over the health of my boys or the happiness of my wife, over the responsibility not to pass a disease on to my fellow citizens? A caring, functional society needs constraints and responsibilities. Terms and conditions apply. A vague grasp of complicated ideas is not the same as virtuous independence. Existentialism has been interpreted by some as a license to behave without regard for societal consequences, but unless I'm mistaken, that's not what the big thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre or Paul Ray meant. Their understanding of free will incorporated a measure of moral responsibility. I may sound like I'm a grumpy old man yelling at clouds, or that I've drunk the Kool-Aid of a quasi-socialist country, but my point of view has evolved with experience, as I've watched and cared about what life has thrown at friends, neighbors, and strangers alike. We have a social safety net here in Canada that includes national health care, daycare, and so on. It isn't perfect, but it works pretty well most of the time, especially for those on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. Living in that kind of society for almost 70 years has made me see the world through more compassionate eyes than I had as a youth or in 1979. Sure, we pay more taxes than many others do, but I prefer to live in a world that gives a, even for people I don't know. Okay, now I'll get off my soapbox. Permanent Waves wasn't the only record I worked on at the studio that year. I was asked to take the helm on a new album by Wireless, and said yes, since I thought the guys were great players and had wanted for a while to try my hand at producing. In December, I booked the 16-track Good Noise Suite on the studio's grounds, with winter in full force, the snow shin-deep, and the air so cold you could crack it over your knee. I once again packed my bags, said goodbye to Nancy, and drove back to Morin Heights. Sitting in the big chair was more of an adjustment than I'd expected. It's one thing to sit beside the producer, spewing forth ideas about your own music and asking him to make it all happen, and quite another to realize other people's ideas as the decider-in-chief. The gig requires a good ear, of course, but also a high degree of resourcefulness and imagination, plus a level of objectivity and tact that I had taken for granted in Brune. I would soon learn that a degree in psychology can also be helpful. Above all, if at the end of the day the chips fall just right and you've helped them make a great album, their lives may be changed for the better, but make a stinker. You might be blamed for it, but you get to move on and work on something new, while the band pays the true price. Steve McMurray and Alan Marshall were Aussies who'd moved to Canada via England in 1975 and formed Wireless with Mike Crawford and the ex-Gato drummer Marty Morin. I found their twin guitar sound driving. All four were excellent musicians, and I especially loved Alan's soulful voice and bass playing. They were pros, eager, good-natured, and willing to do what it took. We bonded quickly, and I had high hopes for the production. It was a low-budget project, but we got a lot done working crazy hours. The thing is, I didn't yet have a ton of confidence as a producer. And after a while, the decisiveness that the job required, the pressure of responsibility, the moods and the deadlines were stressing me out. Studio life can be intense. It demands microscopic attention, and nerves can sometimes fray. Musicians swing back and forth from elation to boredom, from confidence to insecurity. They wait for their turns to bare their souls on tape, and then listen back, overly scrutinizing every note and beat. Working such long hours, it's almost impossible to retain a shred of objectivity. There's usually one guy whose ego needs feeding more than the others, and who constantly tries to wrest control. Oh, that sounds like me. I remember one time when I was mixing a track for another band, which shall remain nameless. The leader challenged my decision to push the guitar, which I felt was the most compelling part of the track, louder in the mix. I made my case, but then the guitarist himself came over and said, "Ged, can you pull back the guitar volume? It's obscuring, you know." He glanced over at the leader. Him. That blew my mind. It was like he was under a kind of spell. I said, "Yeah, but it's the guitar that really makes the song." He replied, and I quote, "Well, the leader is like the flower, and we are like the weeds. The weeds have to be trimmed back so that the flower can be seen clearly." "That's a really interesting analogy," I said, "but I just don't see you as a weed, and we're definitely going to have more guitar on this track." Wireless, meanwhile, had their together. Great guys, no real ego trips, but they did not back down from whatever they felt strongly about. That was fine by me. I wasn't there to bully them into any particular direction, just to capture them on tape at their best. But it did become wearying. As a member of Rush, I could sit for hours polishing every turd and pushing for perfection, but as a studio rat for others, I simply did not have the patience. Managing all that stuff is the most difficult part of the producer's gig, and is one of the reasons I eventually gave up on that particular dream. It demands so many hours in the chair and so much diplomacy that I never got enough joy out of it. I only have the stick-to-itness for my own. One day at the studio, I got a phone call that pulled my brain even further away from the work at hand. Nancy announced that she was coming to Morin Heights. I explained that I was working around the clock, but she didn't care. She wanted to see me that weekend. I thought, we've been together a lot that summer, so maybe now that I was back at work, she didn't like the separation? I wasn't sure what was up. When she arrived, I took an hour's break, and even as I helped her settle into my room, it all came pouring out. She was pregnant and scared stiff. It wasn't just the worry about bringing a human into the world and nurturing it, but having to do it pretty much alone. I tried to be optimistic and reassuring, promising, of course, that I'd support her every way I could. But this was easy for me to say. I was over the moon, but it wasn't my body about to go through hell and back. As a touring musician, I could promise the world, but we both knew it was she who'd have to physically raise the baby, and in the meantime, what would happen to her plans for a career in fashion? How could she possibly cope with both? As I sat there uselessly, she just broke down. In our life together, Nancy has always been the one to sacrifice her freedoms for the sake of our family, our home life, and my work. Even though at only 26 then, she instinctively understood that the road ahead would be toughest for her. This is just one area where so many rock and roll marriages fail. It's an unpleasant fact that few musicians, myself included, are prepared to give up their gig to raise a family. We'll rationalize that we're earning and supporting and so on, and many of us will do our damnedest to pitch in. But for all our best intentions, it's our wives and families who bear the brunt while we get on with our glamorous lives. Nancy basically cried for 2 nights. She knew that regardless of what I said, work would always call me, and I would always respond. She would never ask me to do anything other, so this new chapter of our lives was something that she would have to shoulder largely on her own. And indeed, as she left, with all that weighing on her mind, I went back to work. No sooner had I reassured her that I'd be there for her than I had to pack up my good intentions and leave her again, this time for the Permanent Waves tour. Of course, I was worried about her and ecstatic about being a father, but the new record was greeted with such a terrific response that I was caught up in the throes of a rising rock band hitting its stride. I was obsessed with work, and however much I told myself, or more important, Nancy, that I wanted to help, I wasn't willing to slow my schedule down. Record and ticket sales were solid, and the Spirit of Radio was doing reasonably well, as of all things a single, making a radio splash of sorts in Chicago and elsewhere in the Midwest, as well as in the UK. Our relentless schedule would see us play around 120 more shows before my son would come into the world. Soon I was abroad in June on a terrific UK tour, with a milestone 5 consecutive nights at the Hammersmith Odeon in London. But my mind was elsewhere, expecting a long-distance call at any moment, braced for disaster. We Jews are really good at that. And feeling worse that I was still away on June 20th, our 4th wedding anniversary. I was racked with guilt. Oh yeah, we're really good at that too, and couldn't wait to get home. I finally made it home to my gorgeous, extremely ripe missus, but as we hunkered down, it was soon clear the baby would be late, 2 weeks overdue, in fact, so that we only checked into Mount Sinai on July 21st, when at last they induced labor. Birthing babies was still a pretty formal matter in Toronto back then. Nancy's bestie Karen and my old pal Oscar were restricted to the waiting room, while I was given a surgical gown and mask and accompanied Nancy into an actual operating theater, where I stood beside her, assuring her it would be fine, rubbing her head so nervously to relax her and helping her breathe to the point that she told me to lay off or she'd have no hair left. Man, they should have given me an epidural. I darted out from time to time to give updates to our friends, and although Oscar had smuggled in a case of Carling Black Label, I was too nervous to even drink. I watched as the doctors did their thing, and at 2 in the morning on July 22nd, 1980, Julian Michelle Weinrib came into our lives. I was choked up just looking at him, but when I asked Nancy if she wanted to hold the baby, she said, "Hell no, I've got the rest of my life for that. You hold him. I need a smoke." After they took little Jules to the nursery and Nancy to her room for some well-earned sleep, I went home to the beaches with Oscar and Karen and sat in the backyard with them drinking champagne in the rain, only passing out as the sun came up. Almost immediately the phone rang with Nancy on the other end. "Geddy," she wailed, "they brought me the baby, but I don't know what to do. Please, come over now and help me." Still in a boozy stupor, I literally threw myself onto the shower floor and turned on the cold water, then pulled on the same clothes I'd worn all night and drove like a mad fool to the hospital, parked wherever, ran up the stairs, and dashed into her room. "What?" I said, breathless, sweating bullets. "What's wrong?" With Jules in her arms and a blissful smile on her face, she said in her gentlest voice, "Isn't he adorable?" To quote the immortal Trogs, "Me, Reg." As it surely is for every newbie parent, having Jules at home was a huge adjustment. He wasn't a good sleeper to begin with. Plus, he was colicky, and for some reason, hadn't come with an instruction manual. Neither Nancy nor I had ever been exactly early birds, but that had to change PDQ, and it was especially tough for Nancy, who was the queen of sleep. Throw in a dose of postpartum depression, and you can imagine what she was up against. We hired a nurse to help, but found her untrustworthy and had to let her go. It was a great relief when Nancy's younger sister Barbara moved in with us to help out, but guilt weighed on me once again when I had to rejoin the boys for some writing and recording. I say had to because the band rules, right? Like Big Brother or the Monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey, the band is ever present. It gives a musician an indisputable reason to run off, regardless of the chaos he may be leaving behind. It is ubiquitous, inexorable, and constant. It demands precedence over everything, silently running, and occasionally ruining your life. Of course, it's of your own making, but it is more convenient to think of the band as an entity separate from yourself. Wives, friends, and family are left with little choice but to accept being collateral damage of the band's schedules, obligations, and ambitions. It is never your fault. It is the band's. Since I was 17, it had been my wife's priority. That had to change somewhat now, but realistically, could it? As the last member of Rush to become a parent, I was also the last to experience the guilt of leaving the family behind and to cope with the tension and messiness that came up every time we had to split. Nancy was, for the most part, understanding and accommodating, genuinely wanting me to be happy, but she could not entirely hide a measure of resentment, nor not begrudge the lack of sovereignty over her own life. We tried to see each other's point of view, but before we could ever reach a mutually satisfying solution, I'd be waltzing out the door. How many musicians in history have had that same unfinished conversation? The one that ends with, "Sorry, baby, I gotta go. The guys are waiting." It wasn't fair, but it was what it was. The band was the excuse, and it always won out. But it was a ticking time bomb. Well, that's the end of chapter 16. Let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.